Hello and welcome to this introduction to the latest features of the Prevalent platform. Today we'll be covering findings and compliance. Before we start, a brief introduction into Prevalent itself. So Prevalent is an industry leader when it comes to third-party risk management, and our platform provides a 360-degree view of vendor risks. It can be used for second parties, third parties, and of course fourth parties. The platform aims to improve visibility, adding context to scoring, automates the process, and in turn makes it more scalable. We aim to incorporate multiple feeds to enrich the data that you're able to consume. So today, a few key features that are coming out in the new version of the Prevalent platform, version 3.11. In this feature release, we are introducing findings and compliance, two major changes that are going to enhance how people are able to use the Prevalent platform. I'm going to start with findings. Findings is an enhancement to the submissions section of the platform. So this is where we will review information and data that's been collated on the back of an assessment sent to a vendor or a third party. So underneath the entity, we are able to go and have a look at an individual assessment. We're able to see the progress of the assessment, and we're able to see something called flags. Flags is a new concept introduced to the Prevalent platform that enable you to do some validation or review before a risk is committed automatically. This is achieved in a couple of ways. I can see here that an assessment has been completed, the UCF assessment. I can see how many flags were automatically created, and I can see the number of risks generated automatically. Now I can see this individual assessment has a couple of flags already, so I'm going to view the answers. So within this assessment, I can see the questions and the responses selected as part of the assessment itself. I can see if a risk was created automatically by the assessment, and I can drill down and review the results of that. But if, for example, I've reviewed the information and a risk wasn't automatically created, I'm able to do a couple of new things. Firstly, I'm able to create a risk manually myself, pre-populated based on the risk data that would have been associated to the question, which in turn gets fed to the risk register. So this allows me to create risks as I'm reviewing results of assessments where automatic risks have not been created. This could be, for example, in the event notes or evidence provided does not meet expectations. In addition to that, I'm now able to create tasks against a finding result. So here, for example, I can see that I can create a task. If I go and create a task, I'm able to associate it to the third party or entity in question, and it can relate to the response of the information that I've got. So for example, qualifying data, notes, evidence, whatever's needed to ascertain whether there is a risk there or not. And finally, we have this notion of a flag. For example, I may be a first-line reviewer reviewing the results of an assessment. I have the ability now to add a flag based on notes or evidence, or simply the response selected, which in turn will create a flag on the right-hand side. So here I'm going to say that my answer has been flagged because it needs second-line review. Once committed, this gets fed into our flag status on the right-hand side of the platform. And what this allows any second-line reviewer to do is very simply identify where there is an entity that requires some further validation or some further review. We can see that now on the right-hand side. If I was logged in as a second-line reviewer, I could log in here and I could remove any flags as necessary by either creating risks or creating tasks, or I simply may feel it's justified to do so. So this notion of flags is now there to enable findings to be reviewed and queried without simply creating risks. We can create flags not just manually, but we create them automatically now as well. So when I'm creating a survey or assessment, against each individual answer, I have the ability to mandate a flag. So the event somebody selects an individual response, it will in turn create a flag. The value of this is if you have particularly high risk or concerning responses as part of an assessment, you can automatically flag that data. We can also, when we're sending out an assessment, automatically flag any answers that contain documents, and or notes. So for example, a responder of an entity could attach some evidence. The flag will make sure that I, as a reviewer, will go review the data and in turn check that the evidence is fit for purpose. Equally so, I could be reviewing the notes fields to make sure that I am comfortable with whatever's been articulated and reviewing that context. We feel this findings release is a great enhancement to the whole review and submission process and enables our clients to fill that gap between automatic risk identification and creation and the results of an assessment, and helps remove the opportunity for false positives and, of course, false negatives. In the compliance aspect of the release, we now have the ability to report on the tags and categories of risks. Now, risks are associated to questions and answers, so when an assessment is completed, in this case by Saturn, who's going to be one of my third parties or vendors, I can start reporting on multiple elements. So I can ask one question and identify compliance against multiple frameworks or standards simply by that one question. For example, here, I may want to have a look at compliance against NIST for Saturn. And when I select the NIST status, I can see how compliant Saturn is against NIST based on the data that they've provided. When this is deselected, I can base it on every single question related to NIST in the platform. So I can base this information on not just what they've answered, but also what they haven't answered. All of these compliance aspects are filterable. So in the event I needed to query Saturn specifically and look at individual risks, look at individual survey questions and answers, I can do that as well. But here I can see pass and fail statuses. A pass is when an assessment question has been answered in a way that does not create a risk. A fail suggests that no response has been provided, which is acceptable. So therefore, a risk has been created. I can expand on these. I can see the questions and answers that were selected, which in turn created the risk. And as compliance is binary, we know they are either compliant or not compliant based on this risk itself. Not only do we allow the use of industry standard categories and tags, for example, NIST, ISO 27001 and SIG, clients are able to create their own standards and frameworks and report on compliance there as well. And that can be updated after an assessment is completed as much as before. So you're able to apply tags and report on those against legacy data as much as any future assessments. In the event multiple assessments have been sent out and the status has changed over time, you will be able to see historical data as well. So I can view previous answers if there were any answers to see where perhaps a fail had become a pass and the date that that had happened. Something else that's new in the compliance piece is that you're able to establish a compliance threshold. So in your risk library, based on these categories that create things such as the NIST compliance rating or the cloud computing rating, we can establish a compliance threshold. So for example, if I had established a threshold for NIST, I would see whether Saturn had passed or failed. So I'm going to establish a 30% pass rating for NIST. As we can see, we've done that now. And if we go back to Saturn and refresh, we will be able to see that the status of Saturn has changed. So if I go and select NIST, we can see that they are not compliant against our minimum standard. This way we have a simple reference point to understand good and bad, ultimately compliant and not compliant against any individual framework. We also have now in the reporting section a compliance tab. So if you need to review compliance in aggregate against multiple entities rather than one specific, you're able to do that in the reporting section. So underneath compliance here, we are able to establish specific categories. So again, for example, I may want to look at NIST, or I may want to look at specific answers, specific surveys, or individual risks. Using this, I'm now able to start reporting on every single entity I've engaged with, every vendor, third party, whoever it is I've engaged with, to see who is passing or failing very granular aspects of an assessment. So based on NIST, I can see that Saturn has not passed and my IT team internally has not passed. And I can see what respective areas they tend to be failing in most. As I mentioned before, we can drill down into individual surveys and individual survey questions now as well. So I can see every assessment that's ever been completed, and I can see which question or which response people had responded to. So here I can see that Saturn, for example, has passed this individual question. And every single entity or third party I've engaged with would be here in a list for me to be able to review who has or has not passed any granular requirement. You are, in addition to this, able to start reviewing compliance graphs as well. So pass and fail statuses within this tab. So as you start enriching your data and establishing your pass-fail statuses, you can clearly see what frameworks and assessments you are most compliant against, or which domains you are most compliant against versus the ones that you are not compliant against. Finally, all this data, we have a couple of extra features that have come out that are worth noting. You can now export the full assessment data from a submission. So here I can see Prevalent has done an assessment. I can see how many flags were created, how many risks were automatically created, and I can export all the results through one simple button click. And a final value when it comes to the compliance release is the ability now in the admin section to adjust your own heat map. Now here, for example, I may say that this is not going to be a critical whenever a likelihood score of 2 and an impact score of 2 is identified. Whenever that type of risk is created in the platform, I may define that as a medium based on my business requirements. When I commit that now, all the risks in the platform will correlate to your new heat map. So in the event you use a 5x5 or a lesser model which deviates from the standard, that can now be fully customized. So we hope that the findings and also the compliance releases are going to improve and enrich the data that you consume and also how you use the Prevalent platform. If you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to reach out to us and we'd be more than happy to feed in any additional information. Thank you so much for joining us today.